Greetings. Yes, it's time for another Tumblr question. This time it's from beautifulbearinatutu. It's a long one. Let me take a moment to get through this. Extremely narrow question that probably doesn't apply to the project you're working on anymore, but what would you change about the backer beta process you went through with Pillars 1 and 2 if you had to do it again? I've always been curious. For context, I participated in the first game's backer beta and offered some feedback, but skipped it with the second so that the content would feel more fresh to me. I still watch some videos and check the discussions. The impression I got was that the balancing work done on that slice of content in Deadfire was good for the backer beta, but that once players had the chance to interact with the game non-linearly as intended, the difficulty at release was simply too easy to trivialize. This makes me wonder whether the balancing work done during the beta in that narrow slice of the content was valuable for the overall difficulty/balance of the final game, especially considering I remember your team having to do some balance passes pretty quickly after release to tune up various encounters and the various normal/veteran/path of the damned difficulty levels. But also just in general, I'm curious what kind of lessons were learned in the process, especially since you didn't go on to work on Grounded, which had a similarly extensive pre-release testing period, this time with early access. Good question. So first of all, I would say that the backer beta, the primary focus is not balance, in my opinion. The focus is on the overall experience, and balance certainly is a part of that, especially in a party-based fantasy role-playing game with a lot of combat. Balance is part of that, but also user interface, clarity, performance, just tons of stuff, presentation. And it's not to downplay the importance that balance is in the backer beta, but from our perspective, it's a comprehensive, we want people to bring up kind of everything that they feel about how dialogue is presented, how quests work, all sorts of things. So balance is part of that. And I still think it's extremely valuable, even if the balance work was not ultimately perfect, which I don't think that's really possible, honestly. But I would also say that the biggest benefit when it comes to balance in the backer beta is not on the content side. It's really more about the player side of the equation, meaning how the player perceives progression through the classes, the variety of options that they have. Can they make interesting builds? Do those builds feel viable? I almost view the content in the backer beta as sacrificial because there's no way to balance. There's really no way to balance backer beta content unless you completely redo it in such a way where new players and players that have played through that content ad nauseum, truly dozens of times. I mean, some players might play it 100 times. There's just no way to actually try to balance for both of those experiences. My approach for our backer betas was to use side content, things that the player was going to see at some point during the game, toward the middle, not necessarily a load bearing part of the game, important, but if it wound up being a little bit of dip in quality because we started early and had to iterate on it a lot, and the players in the beta saw it a ton, it wasn't going to really dramatically impact the overall experience and perception of quality. So in Deadfire, that was Tikawara and Pokokahara, which I think we balanced as well as we could, and I think it's good content. I think that there are a few quests in there that early on we set off on the wrong foot with them and we couldn't really make them amazing quests or anything. They're fine. I think that certain pieces of the content, like the area around Pokokahara and the Ingwithan Titan reveal, I think those are great. The balance in that area, again, I was never super concerned about how it would work for new players and players who went through the backer beta. That being said, despite the benefit that we got from that content and people going through it and giving their feedback on the classes and progression and itemization and all that stuff, The big miss for us was we really did not have time to do balance passes for veteran and Path of the Damned. You called out normal, veteran, and Path of the Damned, and just to check my own memory, I went through the notes, and I'm not saying that none of the combats on normal were touched, but it was really veteran and Path of the Damned. I think normal difficulty or classic difficulty was pretty much fine. I think that if you opted into classic difficulty, you were kind of selecting a more forgiving experience. Veteran, though, is very clearly an indication I would like this to be more challenging. And we just didn't have the time. We got compressed on a lot of different fronts. There were a lot of things to tune, and that just didn't get the attention. That's my fault. And we did patch that within about 2 weeks of launch, and we did have to play a lot of catch up on it. I don't think it's the worst thing in the world, but I would have preferred that we had prioritized that earlier. In retrospect, that's on me. And it wasn't really about what the backer beta did, it was about how I had people use their time toward the end of the development cycle. So you could say going back that I would reprioritize that, but I think that has less to do with the backer beta and more to do with just how production worked out. I would say that even if we had used, let's say, the beginning of the game. So as an example, Baldur's Gate 3, their backer beta, if I recall correctly, was more focused on the early game. And I still think we would have had the same issues because a lot of the issues were evident because they got magnified over the course of the game. The later you get in the game, the more the balance gets out of whack just because there are more numbers inputting into the system. And it's obviously, you can say that it's evident even in the early game, but I still think we would have run into the same problems if I had prioritized things the same way. I don't think shifting the focus or where it went would have made it turn out better. And also, and this is not a slam against BG3, but just sort of recognition, at launch, a lot of people really did not speak fondly of how the third act of BG3 was balanced. And that's probably because a ton of people saw the beginning of the game, the early game, and then the mid game got a lot of testing. And as is very common in game development, something slipped through the cracks and they later addressed it. But it kind of has less to do with the backer beta and more to do, once you get the feedback from the backer beta, where are you going to spend your time to make sure that it has the maximum impact? And that's really more of a director priority, production reality sort of concern. I would say Grounded was used as an example. Grounded, not that there's no story in Grounded, but it's very light compared to a game like Deadfire in terms of density of dialogue and things like choice and consequence and quests that can play out in different ways and things like that. Grounded is a very gameplay focused game. And I think for that, having a long early access for a game that's so gameplay focused, they could really just focus on those core things. Which isn't to say that it's easier, but it's just easier to sort of make the focus be entirely that for a backer beta or for early access. So moving forward, what would I do differently? I don't think I would necessarily treat the backer beta any differently. One could say that you could run multiple backer betas, move to a different part of content so that you can test the changes you make systemically in a new part of content. I think that could be valuable. It's also expensive. Setting up backer betas and having those things be separate from the main branch of your game is a not trivial cost. I'm not saying it's not worth doing, but that's the thing. It's sort of like how much time and effort do you want to spend on having a separate track of content and multiple separate tracks of content that are just for people to test and give feedback on versus spending your time on the core game, which is just a difficult balancing act. And as far as what part of the game, where to focus it, I think that would have to do really with the nature of the game itself. I think, again, that some games, you really don't want players to see a ton of the early story because it'll get very tired by the time the game is released and people might be exhausted by it. Maybe you can partition that off. which again becomes complicated. So I think it would really just have to do with the nature of the game. I don't think that the way that we ran the backer betas on Pillars 1 or 2 were perfect, but I also don't think they were terrible or anything. I think I would make better choices about how I spent our resources toward the end of development, though. So, very good question. Thanks, and I hope everyone finds it useful.